Hi, everybody. Like Abe said, my name's Adam. He asked me to come today to share a little bit about my experience and my story, and same with Brett. I'll leave some time for questions and answers, and I won't be the reason we go long, so I'll try to keep it short. I grew up in Oklahoma. My wife and I are both from Broken Arrow. I was in the Air Force for 5 years right out of high school. Then we lived in Arizona for 2 years, finishing college, and then I went to grad school in Boston for 2 years and came back to Oklahoma in 2014 and worked with Governor Fallon's office at the time, and she had me look at the justice system. So that was my first time walking into a prison in the state of Oklahoma, my first time meeting with victims' representatives, my first time meeting with district attorneys. And despite a lot of those experiences being a part of my family's history, those were things that I had never personally experienced. So you can imagine it was a very interesting 3 months. At the same time, my wife and I started going to a church in Oklahoma City that was really the first sense of community that we'd had in a long time. So those two things combined led us to do what we said we'd never do, which is come back to Oklahoma. So we moved back in 2015, and I spent that first year back working with the Texas Public Policy Foundation as their director of Right on Crime in Oklahoma, working with Governor Fallon's office to implement a lot of the things that we had talked about over the summer. Through that work, I was appointed to the State Board of Corrections, where I spent 3 years. I had an opportunity to visit every prison in the state. Several of those visits I just went on my own, and I asked to meet with an educator, a correctional officer, and the warden at each of the prisons. You can imagine, again, just seeing those things and experiencing those things firsthand was very informative for me. In 2017, I started working at City Care, which is a nonprofit base here in Oklahoma City. I've been there since 2017. We provide housing for individuals who are transitioning out of homelessness. And then we also, in April of last year, opened Oklahoma City's only low-barrier night shelter. So this is a place where anybody can come. There's no requirements. So that work, you can imagine, also has really informed my views and how I approach this work. In 2018, actually it was 2017, I had the opportunity to meet Governor Stitt for the first time at the time. Nobody really knew who he was. We had a mutual friend in Tulsa that suggested we meet, and so we did. He came to my office at City Care. We sat down and we talked about justice in Oklahoma. And in 2018, I met with him and his campaign team again and again talked about justice. It was supposed to be Chris Steele and I, and he wasn't able to come, so it was just me again. So we just talked. And then he asked me to serve on his public safety transition team once he was elected, and I did that. And then in 2019, he asked me to serve on the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board. And at the time, I probably could have told you what they do. I could have told you in detail. Certainly had no idea the amount of work that it was, or the scope of the work, the depth of the work, the intensity of it. They said it was part-time, but it became the most consuming thing about my life for the next 3 years. Again, at the time, Oklahoma was not conducting executions, so it wasn't something that the governor and I talked about whenever he asked me to serve on the board. Even if we had, I don't know that I would have been able to articulate the views that I developed over the next 3 years, because as Shane puts really eloquently, I don't think most of us, maybe not in this room, but certainly outside of this room, have really thought critically about how we feel about this. And for me, over 3 years, I spent countless hours, reviewed tens of thousands of cases. As the chairman of the board, conducted the first 5 clemency hearings that Oklahoma had done since 2015 and 2016, and really had to carefully consider my position on this. Foundationally, any particulars of a certain case, I had to decide, what do I believe? And that thought process took a really long time and eventually led me to the conclusion that I couldn't support the institution of the death penalty. And so there were different considerations in each one of the clemency cases that we had to review, but ultimately I voted for clemency all 5 times. The last 2, after the third clemency hearing, so the first one we did was a recommendation for clemency. The second one was not. The third one was. The third recommendation for clemency, we were asked to come meet with the governor. It was in November. I was out of town for Thanksgiving, so we ended up getting to meet until the week after Thanksgiving. And if you remember, that was when we did two of them back to back. It was on a Tuesday and a Wednesday, and then I met with him on Wednesday afternoon. So those two clemency hearings, I was the only one who voted for clemency, so I had a pretty good idea of what the meeting was going to be about. And I went and met with him and his general counsel, and we talked about why I was voting the way that I was. And he gave me an opportunity to explain my beliefs. And I shared as simply as I could that I, as a person of faith, could not find a reason why Jesus would ever vote to execute somebody. And I tried to explain that I understood that that sounded really trite, that I would ask, how would Jesus handle this? But I only tried to live my life in a way where that's a question that I ask. And ultimately, after a lot of prayer and conversation and study, that was the answer that I came to. And then I also, and I shared a little bit about this last night, but, thought about the reality that since 1976, we've now exonerated 190 people off of death row in the United States. 10 of those individuals were from Oklahoma. Again, we talked last night, but Shane has articulated not just the cost in terms of lives, but the cost in terms of years. So those 190 people represent over 1,800 years of life that the United States has taken away from individuals. And for me, I started to think about, okay, this is actually an inherent part of the death penalty institution in the United States, that there is no way to ever guarantee that we don't get it wrong. It's just part of the system. And so for me, I felt like if I was going to move past the question of my support of the system as a whole, then I would have to answer the question, how many people am I okay with killing who are innocent? And that some people can pick a number that they're comfortable with. We may disagree, but at least you're honest with yourself, and at least you're exercising some level of intellectual integrity as you're coming to your conclusions. Personally, my number was 0. And that was very clarifying for me, that beyond the question of faith, if I can't pick a number, then I can't support the death penalty as an institution. And then, again, Shane talks a lot about proximity, so I think the next question, if you can pick a number, then you have to answer the question. Are you okay with knowing who that person is? Are you okay with that person being your family member or your friend? And ultimately, are you okay with being that person? And again, if your answer to any of those questions is no, then you can't support the death penalty. And there were a few other things, but ultimately those were the main ones that led me to this conclusion that I couldn't support it. So again, as simply as I could, I tried to explain that to him, and he said, okay, well, and, he explained the reasons why he felt like he supported the death penalty, and he said, okay, we'll give you some time to think about it. And I said, respectfully, sir, I knew what we were going to talk about today, and I don't need any time to think about it. But if you believe that my position on this negates the rest of my contributions as a member of this board and as the chairman, then you can ask me to resign, and I will. I didn't have to because it's a constitutionally appointed, and he would have had the opportunity to appoint somebody else if he was reelected, but didn't have to. But I told him that I would, and a few months later they did. They asked me to resign, and so I did. Again, at that time, my initial resignation letter said nothing about the death penalty. I had no interest in doing anything other than honoring him on my way out and thanking him for the opportunity that I had to serve, as difficult as it was to leave. And I've talked with you all about this, several of you all about this before, but probably the hardest part being just knowing that each vote really mattered, that each time that I could, even if I was the only one, knowing that that made a difference. And I knew in my heart that I represented people in Oklahoma. They may not be there, they may not be in the position that I was in, but I knew that that vote represented other people in my community. And I knew that that mattered. So leaving because of this position, I knew it was going to cost me the opportunity to continue doing that good, but at a certain point I had to come to terms with I did as much as I could for as long as I could, and that had to be enough. And my wife, Sarah, helped me a lot during that time, and she was like, Adam, you'll never quit. You'll never quit. You have to be okay when it's time to be done. And she was right. And being done, over the last few months, like processing all of that experience, I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to be a small part of that system and be a part of some small changes that took place. And now I get to be in places like this and share my experience and what little difference that may make. I'm grateful for that opportunity too. But again, I had no desire other than honoring him on my way out. And they asked me to explain in my resignation letter why I was resigning. So I put that in there. I sent it to them, and they said that was fine. They asked me to change the beginning of my letter, which said, at your request, to upon personal reflection. And I told them that I wasn't going to do that because it wasn't honest. And then they asked me a second time to change it, and I said that I wasn't going to do that. And I don't share that often, but I feel comfortable sharing that with you all, and that was the reality of what happened. That I told them no, and I felt like I was doing enough to honor them, but also wanted to be honest that I had not resigned for 3 years, despite an immense amount of personal and professional pressure to do so by a lot of different people. And I felt like it was important that when I did finish, people know that the only reason I did it was because he asked. And there was no other reason. I wasn't afraid of anything that was happening despite a lot of things coming to a head during that season. That's not why I was resigning. So I did. I can say now that in April and May of this year, the Oklahoma County grand jury process finished up. I don't know if I'm breaking any rules talking about it. I don't, but I will. I mean, that was a huge part of it. Is that I knew as soon as I started that it was going to come at a cost. I don't think I could have anticipated exactly how much the cost was going to be, and I'll wrap up with this, but my experience over the course of those 3 years not only brought me into closer proximity with the stories of victims' families, the stories of the families who have a loved one being executed, the stories of the tens of thousands of cases that I reviewed during that time, the depths of the depravity that human beings are capable of. But it also illustrated to me very clearly and very personally the power that district attorneys hold in the state of Oklahoma and the formal and informal ways that they wield that power. And the reality that when you finally have that target off your back, the last thing you want to do is put it back on. And they know that. They know that they can use their power over and over and over and over again, however they want to, with very little to no accountability. And that time you're done, you don't want to talk about it anymore. You're just grateful to be out. So my experience is that that's exactly what they did for 3 years. And it was said to me by retired district attorneys who were a part of that process in a joking manner that they had never seen in their 45-year law enforcement career such a coordinated effort to remove members of the Pardon and Parole Board as what happened to Kelly and I over the last 3 years. And there's something to that, and I don't know exactly how to talk about that, but I know that it's important. I know that people need to hear about that, and some measure of change has to come from that. Again, I don't know. I mean, I'm a few months out. I don't know exactly how to talk about that or what's okay to talk about, what's not, but I know that that's important. I know that we have to talk about that, that things about that have to change, that there has to be accountability for the ways they use and misuse the resources of their office. So, again, I've come to terms with the risk associated with taking a stand on something, and I think that part of the work that we can do in the community is showing people that it's okay. It's okay to take a risk, and ultimately, it's okay for it to cost you something. It's okay if it costs you something, and then it's okay if it costs you something dear to you. Because ultimately, I believe that that's what convictions mean, that if you take a stand, you have to be okay with the cost, you have to be okay with the risk, and change doesn't happen without risk. So, again, I'm grateful for the invitation to spend time with you all. I feel like, again, just a small thing that I can do is be a part of conversations like this and offer whatever insight I can about my experience or the process. So I know we're at time, Abe, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer.
First, I'd like to round of applause.
Yeah, it's a great question. And specifically in clemency, there were other reasons in each individual case that ultimately led me to vote for clemency outside of that foundational reason that I came to just disagree with the institution of the death penalty. So I think Mr. Coddington's recommendation for clemency is interesting and might provide some contrast for why I voted for clemency the times that I did. So the first recommendation for clemency that reached the governor's desk was very clearly about concerns about innocence. No one really, I don't remember specific comments that were made, but I think the general sense of the board at the time was that was the reason why clemency was recommended. The third clemency hearing, but the second clemency recommendation to make it to the governor's desk. Again, there was some comments made during the hearing, but the general sense was that after we had conducted the first execution, that was when that clemency hearing happened. And if you remember, if you were there were concerns expressed about how Oklahoma was conducting executions. And that was a general sense of at least those who voted in favor of clemency for why they were voting for clemency. Again, I had other reasons. Mr. Coddington's recommendation is interesting because for two reasons. So one, the makeup of the board is different now than it was. So whereas there may have been a critique in the last 5 clemency hearings about Kelly and I's position, again, despite the fact that Oklahoma passed a law in 2018 requiring individuals like us with experiences like us to be on the board. That's why we were there to begin with. And ultimately, that's why the district attorneys disagreed with our appointment to begin with and why their concerted and concentrated effort to remove us started from day one is because of that bill. All that being said, I don't know how they're justifying satisfying their justification for satisfying that law now, but the reality is the makeup of that board today is very different than it was in the fall. So you now have 2 retired district attorneys. You have one individual who has a background in ministry and also was a former warden. You have one individual who has a background in ministry, also a retired police officer, and you have one individual who is a retired federal probation officer. So there are pieces of social work in ministry, but also a very obvious theme of law enforcement in all 5 of the backgrounds of the individuals. Some may say that as a critique. I say that just to illustrate the point that the makeup of the board is very different than it was in the fall. So the fact that a clemency recommendation has come from this board, I think if you were a person who had a critique about the last board, you can't have that same critique anymore. There is not a more conservative version of this board than what exists right now. You can't get it. There's no other way to have a more conservative iteration of this board. This is it. So if you had that critique before, you have to place more weight on this recommendation. The second reason it's different is because why they've recommended clemency. There is no concern or claim of innocence, and there was no, at least in the board meeting, concerns expressed about the protocols of executions in the state of Oklahoma. The reason they recommended clemency, or at least what you could gather from what they said in the meeting, was the purest reason why you might grant clemency. So put those two things together. This board would make that clemency recommendation for that reason. That I think that has to mean something. So I use it as an illustration because I think that touches on all the reasons why someone might vote for clemency. all the reasons why I did. Each case was very different. But ultimately, and we were talking about this when we met with legislators yesterday, ultimately it comes down to the individual. I mean, you have to make peace with yourself about what you're going to vote and why. Because at the end of the day, whatever you believe you're going to be accountable to, you're the only one responsible for that decision. And some people are comfortable explaining that, some people aren't. But those are some of the things that we considered and why I think the clemency recommendation that's awaiting the governor's decision is unique. Yeah. Yep.
One more quick question, and then we keep moving.
Her hand is up first.
I'm wondering if there is softening among Republican legislators, if that might actually soften the governor's stance.
That's a good question. I don't know.
Can you include your
Sure.
question in your answer?
So you were asking, you wondered if softening among Republican legislators might also soften the governor. Brett may be able to speak more to that, but I do think the reality is some of it is political, unfortunately. I don't know how much of it is. I do believe some of it is. I do. When a governor is not the only person talking about it, whatever extent they are incorporating that into their calculation and how they make this decision may make it easier. I know that's a really vague answer, but the short answer is yes, I think. To the extent that these decisions are political, unfortunately, I do think when other people are supportive, it does make it easier. Thank you.